Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today with Lana Silk, who's with Transform Iran. One of the countries that has seen the fastest growing churches is the nation of Iran. And people like Lana are in the forefront of what's happening there. Part of what Transform Iran does is it actively seeks to bring freedom to the people of Iran, transforming the nation into one that reflects the image of Christ. Recently, she wrote an article called Ramadan Opens the Doors for Christ. And so I'm excited to talk to her about the article, about Transform Iran, what's happening there. So Lana, welcome to the show. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. So I got to ask, so let's start with this, because a lot of people have heard of Ramadan. They know it. I was actually on Temple Mount when they closed it the first day of Ramadan one time. So we've seen it. Ramadan is supposed to be, depending on how you look at it, it's supposed to be peaceful with more charity, a lot of prayers, a lot more worship. But yet historically, there's been a lot of battles, including the taking of Mecca, I think was on Ramadan. There's all this stuff. So what exactly is Ramadan? Is it peaceful? Is it violent? I mean, I think most people out there don't know what that is.
I think the peaceful and violent aspect of Islam is more tied into the concept of jihad and the fighting for Islam. Ramadan is a time where Muslims are really seeking Allah and wanting to get to know Him within the parameters that Islam allows, but also just being more pious in their faith. It's a real discipline of faith where they will fast for a month. They only eat at sundown. They pray more religiously. They're more mindful of their connection to God, their obedience of His demands of them. It's a process of pursuit of God, really, for Muslims.
So why is that a good time then to even, because it's like if I feel closer to Jesus, it would not be a really good time for you to approach me and say, hey, let me talk to you about Allah. So why is this, since it's a closer time for them, why is that a good time to become evangelical to them? I can't say the word all of a sudden. So
I would say, first up, it's a great time to be praying for them. And then the evangelism comes tied in with that. We can't really compare the pursuit of Christ with the pursuit of Allah as an apples for apples comparison, because we know as believers that Jesus is living and He is God. And when we connect to Him, when we spend time getting to know Him, there is a response. It's an interactive relationship. So with that in mind, when you consider an Islamic position there, where they are having that kind of approach and thinking in their faith, wanting to get to know God that much better, please Him better, they're praying more, they have an expectation that there would be some interaction with God. It is a slightly different expectation because there is an element to Allah that is distant from His followers, that He is. You don't have the same expectations of Him that you would of the God of the Bible. But at the same time, there is a pursuit that comes in with a hope, even at least, that God would reveal Himself a little bit better to them, that He would answer their prayers. And of course He doesn't, because He's not a living God. So in that context, my thought goes to Jesus' invitation that says, seek and you will find. And there'll be many Muslims, just like many Christians, that will go through it like a religious ritual, and it will be meaningless to them, and they're just doing it because they have to. But there will be many, many Muslims who will have a genuine desire to know God and to please Him, and they have an understanding of God that is tied into the presentation of God through the Quran and Allah. But when they're really pursuing Him, and we hear so many testimonies of Muslims who in the pursuit of Allah found Jesus. And Jesus Himself is revealing himself to them through dreams and visions, but also even in the course of their Islamic prayers, their namaz. One of our pastors came to know Jesus because she was praying her namaz, and inadvertently, every time she went to say Muhammad, she would say Jesus.
Oh, wow.
So, Jesus responds to a genuine pursuit of God. And when that is there, and if we're praying for that and really inviting the Holy Spirit to do what only He can do, I think it's a really powerful time for Muslims to be finding Jesus.
That story is absolutely incredible. I'm because when you look at it here from the United States, I mean, we see the church very ethnocentrically, I think, and persecution to us here in the U.S. is we don't get invited to the party, or our kids might not be popular, versus in most other places in the world. But when I think about it, though, even in this sense, when I think about the fact of, okay, if we're in the middle of Easter, and if someone had written an article, Easter is a great time to talk about Islam, I would get mad. Like that would be like that, and I would, and I know we're not comparing apples and oranges, but from a completely Americanized Christian perspective of we don't want to be too offensive, we kind of don't. This seems like this flies in the face of what a lot of people would think of that all we're doing is offending, and therefore we can't help in this area. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think the issue of offense is tied into a superiority and a self-righteousness that comes in the approach. But when we love Muslims like Jesus loves them, when we actually care what happens to them, when we understand that Jesus died for them and He wants to rescue them from their sins, and we apply that same filter even to the people that we as humans would brand as the worst, the most evil, the leaders, with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian government, the people that I've had Christians message us and tell us, how dare you be praying for people like that? They should be damned to hell. I mean,
Oh,
approach then is what then breeds offense. But when we think about it in the context of the teachings of the Bible, Jesus saying how we're to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, then that's a whole different kind of approach. And we're coming alongside people that we genuinely care about, that we understand are in a pursuit of God and want to get to know Him. And we don't come in with, you're wrong, I'm right. We come in with, well, help me understand how you relate to God. Let me share with you how I relate to God. You are in honestly, as Christians, we can learn a lot from the discipline of Muslims.
right.
There's a whole month. I know we have Lent, but there is a real, there's a prioritization that goes with Ramadan, with their faith, that this black and white commitment where their faith trumps everything. It takes over their rituals, their daily schedules, their relationships. That kind of discipline is exemplary, and we can encourage them for that. We can tell them that we find it inspiring and challenging. I know I do. And then with that, it's a conversation. So how does that work for you then? When you are fasting for a month, when you're praying that religiously, how does God respond to that? When's the last time you heard Him? What does that look like? And that leads to a healthy conversation that hopefully will lead them to Christ.
It's my experience in dealing with people from the Middle East, and the few people that I have met from Iran, and most of the people I know from Iran actually worked for the Shah. They were expelled or escaped, in 79, 80, in that area, that I ended up working with from a young age, going forward. And it appears to me that they are willing to want to talk about their faith, and they see Christians who aren't willing to do so as not true believers in it. Do you find that to be true, that because of that cultural differences that we almost come across weak in that regard because we're too scared to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And too scared to do much about it either.
Right.
Because
Okay.
compare that to then all the negative that we see tied into Islam. It's a faith in action. So that's their expectation of what true faith looks like, that it would take over your life, that you would be prepared to be ostracized for it and misunderstood for it or hated for it, because it's everything. And honestly, in many ways, Jesus was the same. Jesus was very offensive, and He ostracized people because of His radical faith and His radical teachings. So I think we have something to learn from that. And as Christians, we should be mindful of how radical we are in our faith. and how black and white we see things, because it is black and white in the Bible. A lot of things that we try to soften are actually quite black and white. And Muslims get that, and that's where they see the weakness in Christianity, because it's too soft, it's too tolerant in many ways.
So I'm going to kind of transition to what you do with Transform Iran, because let's say you have these conversions during Ramadan, because are we in the middle of it now, or we're about to be? I can't remember the month of it that it's there, but we're really close. I know, if we're not starting it, but um, they get converted during Ramadan. They understand, they recognize it, and they're like, okay, I want to be a Christian now. What happens at that point in time? Is it because here again in the United States, we see too often of people like, oh, hey, I saved 300 people today in jail because they came up and they said the prayer, and then that's it. We leave them alone. They go back to their normal lives. They get out of jail and they go back to the streets. What happens with them from there? Because it's a little bit different than just when you convert there. Obviously, there's some significant consequences. So what happens from there to help encourage them with a discipleship? So there's a practical tool, and I get with that one in a minute, but there's also the spiritual tool of continuing down that faith. What happens with them there to start moving down that path? And then we'll ask the question about the practical tool of, because they lose family, friends, everything else that can come along.
Yeah, so there's an important initial difference there, in that even in that first exploration and pursuit, Iranians know there's going to be a cost. So it's not something that they would even look at without understanding there's a consequence to even the question that they're asking and the road that they're potentially going to travel down. And that already is a positive thing, because there's no lukewarm Christianity. There's you're in or you're out. So that's healthy. And then it makes me think about the Great Commission, which is tied into, of course, disciples and not converts.
Right.
So we're very mindful of that, how our call is to make disciples and not converts, and especially in a context like Iran, where people are converting. They're so disillusioned with Islam and so aware of Islam's inability to meet their needs and empower them in any way at all in their lives, that they're looking for something more meaningful, because they're deeply spiritual people, Iranians. There is a growing tide of atheism because they're despondent with what religion has done to them over the last 50 years. But really culturally and in their sort of worldview, they accept that there has to be something more than sort of the matter. Atheism hasn't taken hold in the same way that it has in the West. So they're looking for truth. Okay, so if it's not this, if it's not what I've always been told, what else could it be? And that pursuit itself is costly. And when they find it, they latch onto it. So then it's easier to come alongside them and say, okay, right, now you've experienced Christ, now you've had this encounter. This is the rest of the journey. And we get to walk with them. A lot of that we do remotely for their safety and ours. So we have a digital program that they can sign up to. It's a year-long weekly call that they have. And we have a whole curriculum that we've developed where we will take them through theological issues, but also there's lots of even cultural worldview related things. In the West, people will say, oh, it's an atheist culture. Well, I would question that. There's a lot that is in our culture here, in our worldview, that's actually quite biblical and
Right.
in the filter, just even in the arguments that atheism makes to do with what God should be like and how he should.
Right.
Pretty Christian assumptions, whereas in the Middle East, it's totally different assumptions. So it's a great joy, really, to come alongside them and say, actually, God is like this, not like that. This is how you would talk to him. This is how he talks to you. You can hold your head up. I remember being a child and being in some of these meetings, and the women, especially the women, crying, wailing, head in the ground, just to sort of surrender to Jesus, and noticing the leaders coming alongside them and encouraging them. Jesus wants to look at you face to face. He knows your name. He wants to hear from you at that level. That's a whole new education to them from what they've been taught before. So that program that we take them on takes them through all these kinds of things too. And normally what happens in that process is these people are experiencing a transformation in their own lives. sharing the gospel with the people around them, and people are getting saved, or at the least very interested. So at some point through that journey, that person will put our counselor on a speakerphone and say, you know what, I've been telling other people, now there's 30 people in my house and we all want to hear you. So that journey again of discipleship with this person is evolving now from helping them figure out their own faith and walking it out with Jesus to knowing how they can now feed the people that they're inadvertently pastoring, maybe only 6 months into their own Christian life. So it's a great way to see growth, and to make sure that there's this discipleship is something that is passed on and is growing naturally through their life.
All right. So practically, though,
Yeah.
many people that convert can't go home and tell their family, because the risk involved in it are huge. I mean, it's illegal to practice, is my understanding. It's illegal to own a Bible. But you also have the family home, which they can be thrown out. They can be, I think probably depending on the extreme, they can be killed as well. So practically, how you want them to go forward and also, spread, but we also want to keep them safe, because you can't do much, you can't do much discipling when you're dead. So like, what do y'all do? How do y'all help in that area? I'm assuming there's other organizations you might partner with as well. Like, how does all that work?
Well, a lot of that will, of course, depend on their own family setup. So you're right. It is illegal. It's punishable by death. A lot of the times before we get to a point of death, there's so many other ways in which the government will harass and intimidate people to try to dissuade them, right down to shutting down businesses, making it difficult for them to find employment. Really, the government just wants it to stop. And they don't want the publicity of martyring people. So it's to what extent can they frighten the Christians enough to silence them? So the people themselves who come to know the Lord understand their own family dynamics. And we do get both extremes. We get the ones where a whole household is saved pretty quickly. And we get the ones that are in danger of their own lives and have to escape or have to try to keep their faith hidden. Keeping their faith hidden is very difficult for Iranians in their immediate familial setup because it's so close. That family relationship is very close. And these people are experiencing dramatic life changes themselves. And, it's the whole hide it under a bushel. No, like they cannot keep quiet.
Right.
So, and it's a lot of advice around, right, are you safe in your home? We've had situations where we've had to relocate people. We've had situations where people have had to escape the country. We've had to help them with legal things to get them into another country. And then it all starts again. The process for asylum. They usually have to leave everything behind, so they have no means of income. There's a whole humanitarian aspect that goes with that. But more often than not, people in their immediate homes are finding that their own life change is such a powerful testimony that it is having a positive impact. The advice is often to do with how do you then keep that safe beyond your home? As people are getting saved and as your house church is growing, how can we be sensible in the number of people who are coming in and out of your house regularly, how loud the meetings are getting? And, we have a lot of experience in that area now in advising them when they should be dividing up into more than one house, how often they should be gathering, where they should be gathering. And by God's grace, we've been able to keep people out of prison for a number of years now.
That's awesome, because again, these are things that we don't comprehend, and I hopefully never will. But I don't. But anyway, regardless, it's great that you're able to look at that and handle that. But then they have to remain committed in a very hostile environment. How do you help them remain committed in this situation? Or do you think the hostility helps the same way that the first church experienced the hostility, or the underground church in China, which is growing? Do you think the hostility helps them remain committed, or is there tools that you use to help them during those moments?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think sadly the hostility does help in many ways. I would say it forces you as a believer to count the cost and to prioritize well. I think it's a real challenge for us here in the West, where we are so very free that our challenge, the danger that we can slip into, is almost like a consumer mentality to our faith. From Bibles to churches and podcasts and radio stations, and there's just so much, and it can even be overwhelming, but we can develop this sort of, well, what's good for me and what works for me and how does this fit well into my life? And those luxuries are not afforded people in a persecuted environment. So there is another side of the coin of that persecution that forces that deep intimacy and dependency on Jesus, because they have to. That's a survival thing then. And you'll speak to a lot of believers who come out of that environment who've then had to escape and will say, wow, those were some of my sweetest, most powerful, intimate times in my faith, where Jesus was so real and he led me in person so powerfully, because that was survival for them. So there is that side to that for sure. But there is also the attack on their joy, on their peace, on hope. That's when Christian fellowship and community is really important, and we are designed to need each other for that strengthening and encouragement of each other. We rely a lot on a digital connection with the believers in Iran for that, at least as a first course. A lot of Christians will at first be isolated until these amazing things happen when communities are saved. They are the first. So they need Christian relationship. We have a digital church network, which would be their first point of connection. About 25,000 Iranians connect to that every month as their Christian church, their Christian body. And there are a whole range of ways in which they can connect. So those who are super nervous, beginnings of their journey, might just want to watch something back on playback. We have a live satellite service that happens on Friday nights, which is prime time in Iran. Then they can call in and have a little bit more interaction, right through to a Sunday Zoom meeting where they can actually come into a Zoom meeting and turn their video on if they're comfortable and really connect in with the meeting and interact with it. And then even more intimately through the week, we have prayer rooms. There might be 6, 8, 10 people in the prayer room, and they can come and pray with other believers and be strengthened in their faith. So there are layers of exposure depending on what they're comfortable with. And then with that, a whole range of resources. So there's an interactive apologetic center, there's an online Bible college. So also there's an app they can download, and there's tens of thousands of materials on there. So we resource them as best we can, but we try to keep it as relational as we can do it through the digital church and then the counselors that would call them as well.
That's really, really cool, because that's a whole new way of looking at the technology. As you said here, it's you're right, you can get it anywhere, but there it seems to be a little bit more. I like the way that you're actually making it more dedicated and more. You're being more diligent with how you're using it for them. I think that's really amazing. So, does what you're doing change depending on whether it's a Sunni Muslim or a Shia Muslim? Is there a difference in how you look at it? Because the Sunni obviously has more population, but they're not the ones in control. So is there a difference, or does it really matter in the approach and how you approach whichever Muslim it is that you're talking about, or which group I guess you're talking about?
There are very subtle differences, but really by and large, even the Sunnis in Iran will have that sort of Shia filter and understanding as well. They may not agree with everything, but the bulk of our communication, and certainly the programs that we have developed, have the Iranian Shia in mind. So we primarily focus on that, but there is a minority Sunni population in Iran who is also persecuted, and they would be able to engage in the way that any minority in Iran would. And we have enough of an understanding of the nuances of their faith, or we can get into the integrities if they have it, and particularly on our apologetics center, where if they've got questions relating to the variations even within Islam, and then how that interacts with Christianity, those would be the places where we would direct them to get those things straightened out.
What is the biggest, when you're having these conversations with people, what is the biggest objection that they have? I've heard of multiple different things, whether it's the idea of a Trinity, whether it's the fact God walked here, whether or not the Bible has been corrupted. What do you find is your biggest obstacle that you have in talking with just the everyday person, not a scholar of Islam, but just everyday people? Where do you find the biggest wall to break down?
Well, you kind of the everyday person isn't going to be bringing us those big theological questions. The
Right.
everyday people are after a some kind of personal experience of God that is meaningful and real. And so a lot of those conversations are centered about around the reality of Jesus's deity, which is one of the bigger objections, and we can come to that, and how he relates to them. So they're after their personal connection. How does this work? When I pray, I don't hear. What does that? But then Jesus appeared to me, and this happened. What does that mean? So it's a lot more personal. The questions that people are asking, if there's just the everyday people who are not throwing in theology in with it. But when we get into the theological mindset, you basically covered them. The most important, Jesus' deity, how can he be the Son of God and the Son of Man at the same time? How can he be born of a human? Did Mary have relations with God? That's very confusing to them. How can
Right.
Mary have a child and that child be God? And then the Father is God. Like that just, it's all heresy to them. So helping them understand, which, let's face it, a lot of Christians don't really have this straight in their head. How do
No.
you and at the same time, that's a big question for them. The concept of the Trinity, you have three gods, and helping them understand that no, we don't. It's one God, and this is how he manifests. Of course, for me, I should say, not necessarily, of course, but for me, the most beautiful thing about the Trinity is the fact that he is completely self-sufficient and independent. And the way I like to explain it to Muslim friends is, well, if God is just one person, then he needs humans in order to be able to express certain emotions or experience certain relational experiences that you cannot have without another being. So even love is meaningless and cannot exist if you're just the only being ever. So, of course, Trinity is so beautiful because within the Trinity, God does not need us. He can express all of it: love, friendship, mercy, grace, all these relational attributes that cannot exist without another being to either give that to or receive it from. So that's a great way to be able to help Muslims understand that no, this is one God, but this is one complete independent God that doesn't need humans in any way. Whereas actually Allah needs humans. Allah needs affirmation. Allah needs to be worshipped. Our God requires our worship, but doesn't need it. He's perfectly fine without it. Explaining those things, and the corruption of the Bible is the other big one, because the Muslims will believe that the Quran came perfectly down to Muhammad in one piece. It was written in one go, and this is why it's so important for purist Muslims that can only ever be read in Arabic in its original format. Even translation isn't great because it needs to be exactly how God delivered it. And when we have all these different versions of our Bible and discussions about points of theology, for Muslims, it discredits the validity of the Word of God, and we have to help them understand what that looks like.
Even though that there is that major distinction between the Sunni and Shia, that it seems like, since, I mean, that was right from the outbreak. I mean, right from the beginning of Islam, they still believe that it's more pure, recognizing that there's a difference. Are they just not taught the history of the Quran, or is it just, again, verbal passed down? I guess, how do they get that kind of part confused? Because I recognize there's differences among denominations of Christianity, but I understand kind of where I can look at the history and say, oh, well, this is why. This is where Martin Luther split from the Catholics, and this is where the Anglicans split. But it doesn't seem like that they acknowledge the fact that there isn't anything, because it has to be so pure and perfect. How do they do that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's when you get into those kinds of questions that you start to use sort of apologetic tools to help them understand the holes in some of what they're holding to be true. And that is a great evangelistic tool in leading them to Christ. There is almost a protecting and hiding some of these core things within Islam. And, it's not they don't discuss and debate their faith in the way that Christians would and really get into the roots of it and want to understand it in that way. And some of it is tied into protecting it from from accusations against their faith and finding holes and inconsistencies. Some of it is because they just don't know
Right.
all the answers. But generally, people aren't invited into that kind of open discourse. The God of the Bible welcomes questions. I mean, even if you just look through Job, there's a dialogue. It's okay to have questions, but now let me ask you some of my own, and let's not that way in Islam. You don't question God. You're not invited to know him in the same way that you're invited to know the God of the Bible.
This is really amazing, because I've only looked at it from that theory side of things, and I've read books about it. Again, I've engaged in conversations with people when I wasn't a Christian, and so for me, to understand this personal side of it is eye-opening to me. I love what you're doing. I think it's incredible. It was kind of even eye-opening for me. I grew up in church, but I wasn't a Christian, and it was eye-opening to me to understand that relationship side. So I don't know why it wouldn't work for everybody else. It's incredible what you're doing. So if people want to know more about what you're doing, want to know more about this. I guess everything is happening, not only just what's happening, but also know more about your organization. Where do they go? How do they find out about it? Give us all the resources. Tell us everything.
Well, everything really is through our website, transformiran.com. You can access all of our resources and sign up to our newsletter and support the ministry in any way you want. It's a pretty a rich website in content. We have a section on there called Learn, where if you really want to get your head around some of these subjects, there are articles about the history of Iran, the church in Iran, how it developed, biblical history of Iran. There's Iran is all over the Bible. In fact, one of my colleagues was only half jokingly telling me that he reckons Persian was the second main language of the Old Testament. And he was giving me all these examples. Well, think about it. Esther would have spoken Persian. Daniel would have spoken Persian. So, there's a rich biblical history, and I think people sometimes forget, and we look at Iran as an Islamic nation, and actually Iran was more Christian first than it was Muslim. So you can really get your head around some of those subjects and learn about a people that God loves and he's busy redeeming right now. And then also through our website, we would encourage you to sign up to our newsletter, because if you want to pray about what's happening in Iran, and I would encourage you to do that, because Iran is key to change in the Middle East. We're praying for peace in the Middle East. We're praying for Israel. Iran is at the root of most of the problems in the Middle East today. And God is busy at work in this country. And that's the news that we don't tend to hear, that it's the fastest growing evangelical church in the world. There's revival happening behind the scenes in Iran. So if you want to be encouraged by the truth of what's happening in Iran and have your hope stirred for what could still happen and how the story of Iran could change, I'd say get our newsletter. It's a once a month email. It's free to receive it. And that will really help you align your faith and your expectations to what God is doing and pray accurately. So transformiran.com for all of that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you being on. This has been fascinating conversation. So again, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate all you're doing, and I just encourage you to keep it up. And at the beginning of the show, you mentioned people saying you shouldn't pray for them. That don't let firefighter Christians put the fire out. Keep fighting. So thank you so much.